Well, you asked for it. Communicating change in 10 minutes. Okay, so communicating and narrating change in 10 minutes. Well, as every good textbook will tell you, communication is absolutely key in a change process. And yet the complexities of what that means are rarely touched upon. Predominantly, you find actually that underlying a lot of what is within the change management literature is what they call a very traditional instrumental or functionalist framework. And the idea within here is broadly within the idea that, broadly encapsulated by the idea that communication involves a message which passes between a sender and a receiver. Now, as we all kind of appreciate, if communication was quite that simple, we'd all be perfectly brilliant at understanding every single aspect of every single subject on the face of the planet. And I can tell you, as an educator of the last 17 years, it's certainly not been my experience of it. No offence. So within change management itself, you do find actually this traditional approach still has great resonance. The assumption is that management come along with a great grand plan or a vision of what the organisation is or should be. They communicate that one, and they are charged with and often prescribe particular ways in which the organisation is seen to be, should follow on from it. So employees become not agents of change, as in somebody who is doing something, but rather targets of change, or indeed targets of redundancy. The change agent, the person who is speaking, becomes the prime mover, the person who is sending that message out, takes the active role within it, and the receiver takes it on as being something that they passively accept and should enact later on. Now, the example that I'd pull up is a partnership, a discussion between the two chief executives of Cisco and Ericsson, who in the video are talking about their merger. Well, it's not a merger; it's a partnership. I should say very quickly. And I think if you listen to that one, you'll hear within there some talk about this is what we are going to do. We have come together for to realise some benefits, specific benefits, to access some markets and to leverage the value that they see in each other's and others' models. But there's actually something more going on there, because of course these two individuals have been talking about this move for the past year, as you'll hear. So what's really interesting in there is that they in some ways don't just reflect the functional model, but also the alternative constructivist model, where what's going on within there is far more complex. Communication is happening as something between people that's communicating a message, but is engaged in a dialogue that says, this is what I think on one side, and the response from the receiver is shaped by the way they understand and interpret that message. So what happens is you get a dialogue that's happening within the conversation. So in broader terms, in change situations, this is really where you do get into the process of negotiating change, of trying to come to terms with what a change means on a very personal or a very practical level. So it's often not something that you see in the chief executive's announcement, but it is embedded within the way that people come to enact and to talk about what's requires to be done. And that's because actually communication isn't simply that sufficient transfer of here's knowledge about what needs to be done, away and do it. It's far more subtle than that one. And when you press beneath the surface, communication isn't just about what is being said, but it's also about the way it's interpreted, the beliefs and values that underlie what is being said, but also how it is being received by the people that get that message. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that happens underneath the subject, underneath the surface, when we start to understand more of the context of it, which feeds into that process of making sense of change. So if you go and look at the second video, which is by an external analyst talking about the Cisco Ericsson merger stroke partnership, then you'll start to see a different element of that. There's a whole bunch more context to it, and I would challenge you to just sit and feel yourself reinterpreting what these chief executives were talking about at the beginning, and you'll understand why I keep muddling up between partnership and merger, because clearly at some level they were trying to achieve the benefits of a merger without necessarily getting into the underlying politics of what's going on there. So suddenly partnership talk isn't just about opportunity, it's about competition as well. Okay, but this in itself sort of demonstrates that underlying problematic of communicating change, because whenever a chief executive or a change agent makes a proclamation of what is to go within there, people aren't just interpreting what happens in the surface. No. What's the most important part of communication is the stuff that's not said, the way in which we read what's being said by that individual at that particular period of time. So what usually happens is when the change pronouncement is made, is everybody is trying to read the subtext of what's going on there. So the communication reflects an organisation's culture in a broader sense, and it's the aspects of where openness is absent is where you get grapevines, is where you get rumours, is where you get dissent emerging from. So at some level, people will look to communication to provide them the information and the certainty of this is what is going to happen. But even then, they will in some way deny that certainty by reinterpreting what is possible in there, what's impossible in there, or what the real meaning of what's going on there. So when the chief executive stands up and says, we're going to realise the benefits and the synergies between two organisations, it's quite legitimate and quite often, and indeed inevitable, that people are thinking, yeah, well, that probably needs job cuts, doesn't it? Now, that in its own sense suggests that people are interpreting in a way, and there's a whole range of skills that can be developed for people who are going to undertake the role of change agency around trying to improve their communication practices in order to maximise change receptivity. So Fram and Brown's paper is really good in this one of trying to look at what characterises negative, neutral and positive communication to enhance change receptivity. And my third video from the Cisco Ericsson case concerns two marketing executives who are obviously trying to sell the change, not to employees this time, but to customers, to say, come and work with us, we can do, we've got enhanced and expanded capabilities. Now, aside from the fact that the marketing executive from Cisco seems to be some kind of freak, it's actually quite an interesting video to watch and think, how are they trying to create change positivity, this receptivity for change? Now, in a way, what they are trying to do and demonstrate between the pair of them and encourage customers to engage in is they want to try and negate and remove and mitigate the levels of obstacles that seem to be within there. So they're using very developmental language, positive language, in order to enhance that receptivity. They're trying to equalise the power relations and to encourage people to accept this as something that doesn't fundamentally change what they have been doing, but encourages them to think about the possibilities of what could be within there. Okay, so they don't use the continuous change, but they use the developmental. They use the opportunity talk in order to provide that gloss of positivity or a positive spin to it. Now, why do I keep going on about bleeding talk? You know, communication of what people are saying within you. Does it really matter? Well, of course, it's not just me saying you need to communicate in a way that is positive when you're making pronouncements about change. Change is something which is informed by the thoughts that we have, and indeed in turn informs the thoughts that we have because we've heard things that we've heard things through talk. Talk itself then takes part in discussions, and discussions themselves are what forms the basis of opinions that we bring into meetings as formal places in which decisions are chewed over and ways forward are debated. They themselves form into records, and they form into minutes and into policy statements. And of course, policy statements or decisions or specifications all form into actions. So really what you get within there is an important thing to understand is the way in which the discursive realm, this idea of thoughts and talk and communication, is integral to the process of developing actions and the material things that happen on an everyday basis.